The aged photograph sits on the mahogany table, its edges worn and yellowed with time. A family portrait from 1906. Father, mother, 3 children, and something else. Something that shouldn't be there. Welcome to Shadow Frames, where the unexplained finds its voice in the darkness. Winter in New England, 1906. Snow blankets the ground outside the Blackwood family home in Deerfield, Massachusetts. A modest 2-story colonial structure that had weathered nearly 8 decades of harsh winters and scorching summers. The clatter of horse-drawn carriages on cobblestone streets and the distant whistle of steam engines marked the dawn of a new century, one filled with promise and technological wonder. Inside, 7-year-old Thomas Blackwood sits at a small wooden desk by the window, watching snowflakes dance in the pale afternoon light. His small hands grip a piece of charcoal as he meticulously works on a drawing. Thomas was always drawing, a talent his father, William, a respected professor at the local university, encouraged despite the practical concerns of the era. Many of William's colleagues believed that artistic pursuits were a frivolous waste of time for a boy who should be focusing on more practical skills. But William had always sensed something special in his son's gift. The room is quiet except for the occasional crackle from the fireplace and the soft scratching of charcoal against paper. A kerosene lamp casts a warm glow over Thomas's work as the winter afternoon light begins to fade. The walls of the room are adorned with framed botanical illustrations and maps, William's personal collection from his years of academic study. "A penny for your thoughts, young man," William says, entering the room with the day's newspaper tucked under his arm. The headlines speak of President Theodore Roosevelt's railroad legislation and tensions brewing in Europe. He's still wearing his wool suit from the university, his beard neatly trimmed in the fashion of the day, a gold pocket watch chain stretched across his vest. Thomas doesn't look up, his concentration unbroken. His dark hair falls across his forehead as he works, the tip of his tongue poking slightly from the corner of his mouth in concentration. "I'm drawing us, Father. All of us." William smiles, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles as he peers over his son's shoulder. The scent of pipe tobacco clings to his clothing. "My word, Thomas, your mother was right. You do have quite the gift." The drawing is impressive for a child of 7, a carefully composed family portrait. William recognizes himself, standing tall with his characteristic pocket watch chain. There's his wife Elizabeth seated in her favorite chair, her long dress carefully detailed with small buttons down the front and lace at the collar. Thomas has drawn himself and his 2 older sisters, Margaret and Catherine, standing in front of their parents. The likeness is remarkable, capturing Catherine's serious expression and Margaret's slight smile. But there's something else. Another figure. William's brow furrows. And who might this be? He points to a small figure standing beside Thomas in the drawing. A young boy, perhaps 4 or 5 years of age, with a cowlick in his hair and a slightly crooked smile. Thomas looks up, his eyes clear and earnest. "That's James, Father." William chuckles nervously, running a hand through his graying hair. "James? We don't know any James, son." "He's my brother," Thomas says with absolute certainty. "He told me he's coming to us soon." A cold draft seems to sweep through the room despite the fire burning steadily in the grate. William feels a strange sensation at the base of his spine, like the whisper of something beyond his understanding. Elizabeth enters the room, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. Her chestnut hair is pinned up in a practical style, though a few strands have escaped during her work in the kitchen. "What's this about a brother?" William shows her the drawing, his expression a mixture of amusement and mild concern. "Thomas has quite the imagination, dear. He's invented a brother named James." Elizabeth studies the drawing, her face paling slightly. She places a hand on her stomach, a gesture so subtle that William doesn't notice. Her eyes, usually warm and bright, seem to cloud with something like recognition. "It's just a child's fancy," William dismisses. "Perhaps a friend from school?" Elizabeth nods, but her eyes linger on the drawing. "Thomas, would you help your sister set the table for dinner? Your father and I need to speak privately." Thomas carefully sets his charcoal down on a small cloth beside his paper, ensuring it won't roll off the desk. "Yes, Mother." He slides off his chair and heads for the door, his footsteps light on the wooden floor. Once alone, Elizabeth turns to William, her voice barely above a whisper. "William, I haven't told anyone yet, but I'm with child. The doctor confirmed it just yesterday." William's eyes widen, and he instinctively reaches for the back of a chair to steady himself. But how could Thomas possibly know? And a boy named James. That's impossible, Elizabeth finishes. "Unless," William shakes his head firmly. "No, Elizabeth, it's simply a coincidence." Thomas has been asking for a brother since Margaret was born. This is just his wishful thinking made manifest. But something in Elizabeth's expression suggests she isn't convinced. She takes the drawing from William's hands and studies it more closely. Look at the detail, William. The way he's drawn this boy, James. It's as if he's seen him. William squares his shoulders, his academic mind seeking rational explanation. Children have vivid imaginations, Elizabeth. You know this. And Thomas has always been particularly sensitive. Sensitive, Elizabeth echoes. She traces her finger over the figure of James in the drawing. Is that what we're calling it now? William sighs and places his hand over hers. What would you have me say? That our son can see the future? That he knows things he cannot possibly know? The university board already thinks my interest in psychical research is bordering on the disreputable. I'm not asking you to announce it to your colleagues, Elizabeth says quietly. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that there are things in this world beyond our current understanding. William looks back at the drawing. Let's wait and see, shall we? If we do indeed have a son, and if he does bear a resemblance to this imagined brother, then perhaps we can discuss this further. Elizabeth folds the drawing carefully and slips it into her apron pocket. I'll keep this safe then, as evidence. 3 months later, Elizabeth's pregnancy is now known to the entire family. The initial surprise has given way to practical preparations. William has cleared out the small room adjacent to the nursery that had been used for storage, and Elizabeth has begun to knit tiny garments in the evenings by the fire. Thomas continues to speak of James as if he already exists, telling his sisters stories about the games they would play together and the adventures they would have. His certainty never wavers, which begins to unnerve even the practical Margaret. James doesn't like porridge, he announces one morning at breakfast, as the family sits around the table eating the hot cereal that is a staple of winter mornings. Margaret, 12 and practical, rolls her eyes. Her hair is braided neatly, and she sits with perfect posture, already showing signs of the proper young lady she is being raised to become. Thomas, James isn't real. Mother's baby hasn't even been born yet. James is real, Thomas insists, his spoon forgotten in his bowl. He shows me things. Catherine, 10 and always curious, leans forward. Her eyes, like her mother's, show intelligence and a willingness to consider ideas beyond the ordinary. What things does he show you, Thomas? The future, Thomas whispers, his eyes wide. He showed me the big war that's coming. A heavy silence falls over the breakfast table. The mention of war in 1906 seems absurd. The great powers of Europe are at peace, despite occasional tensions. The previous century's conflicts feel distant and resolved. William sets down his coffee cup with more force than necessary, the porcelain clattering against the saucer. That's quite enough, Thomas. I don't want to hear any more about these morbid fantasies. Elizabeth places a calming hand on William's arm. He's just a child playing pretend, William. Then he should pretend about more pleasant things, William says tersely. Catherine, please help your brother finish his breakfast. I need to prepare for my morning lecture. But that night, after the children are asleep, William finds Thomas's sketchbook and flips through it by the light of a single candle. There are dozens of drawings, strange machines that look like flying metal birds, cities with buildings taller than any William has ever seen, and men in uniforms fighting with weapons he cannot comprehend. The detail is extraordinary, far beyond what he would expect from a child of Thomas's age. One drawing in particular catches his attention, a scene of soldiers wearing strange masks, surrounded by barbed wire and destruction. In the corner, Thomas has written in his childish scrawl, James says this is called a gas attack, and it's very bad. It's just imagination, he tells himself, closing the book, but his hand trembles as he places it back on Thomas's desk. As a man of science, William believes in the rational, the explainable. Yet as he looks down at his sleeping son, he cannot help but wonder what is happening inside that young mind. The winter gives way to spring, and spring to summer. Elizabeth's pregnancy progresses normally, though the heat of July and August makes her uncomfortable. The doctors assure William that everything is proceeding as expected, and the baby should arrive in late August or early September. Thomas continues to draw. His teachers at school note his exceptional talent and also his occasional strange comments about the future. William receives a concerned note from Thomas's schoolmaster, suggesting that perhaps the boy is being exposed to inappropriate literature of a speculative nature. William assures the schoolmaster that Thomas reads only what is suitable for a child his age, but privately, he begins to monitor his son's behavior more closely. He notices how Thomas sometimes stops in the middle of play, his head tilted as if listening to a voice no one else can hear. How he sometimes speaks in sentences that seem too complex, too adult for a child of 7. And the drawings continue. Page after page of Thomas's sketchbook fills with visions of a world that doesn't yet exist. August 17th, 1906. The summer heat is oppressive as Elizabeth goes into labor 2 weeks earlier than expected. The local midwife and doctor are summoned to the Blackwood home, arriving in a horse-drawn buggy that kicks up dust from the dry summer roads. William paces in his study while the 3 children wait anxiously in the parlor, the grandfather clock ticking loudly in the corner, marking the passage of time. Thomas sits calmly, working on another drawing. "Aren't you worried about Mother?" Catherine asks, her face pinched with concern. She sits on the edge of the sofa, her hands twisting a handkerchief. Thomas shakes his head, his charcoal moving steadily across the paper. James says everything will be fine. Margaret stands by the window, watching for any sign of additional medical help arriving. "How can you be so certain? Mother's pains started early. That can be dangerous." James knows, Thomas says simply, not looking up from his drawing. Catherine moves to sit beside Thomas, peering at his work. "What are you drawing now?" "James's hands," Thomas replies. "See? He has a small birthmark here between his thumb and finger. It looks like a half moon." The sounds of Elizabeth's labor occasionally reach them, causing both girls to wince. But Thomas remains serene, focused on his drawing, as if he alone knows the outcome is assured. After 7 hours of labor, a cry pierces the tense silence of the house. The children look up, eyes wide. Thomas smiles and puts the finishing touches on his drawing. The doctor emerges from the bedroom, wiping his hands on a towel. His waistcoat is rumpled, and sweat stains the collar of his shirt, but his expression is one of relief and satisfaction. "Congratulations, Professor Blackwood. You have a healthy son." William rushes to Elizabeth's side, finding her exhausted but radiant, cradling a small bundle wrapped in soft white cotton. Her hair is damp with perspiration, her face flushed, but her eyes shine with love as she looks down at the newborn. "We have a boy," she whispers, her voice hoarse from the exertion of labor. William swallows hard, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "What shall we name him?" Elizabeth meets his gaze, and he knows the answer before she speaks. "James. His name is James." William nods slowly, a shiver running through him despite the August heat. "James it is, then." The 3 children are allowed to meet their new brother. Margaret and Catherine coo over the infant, marveling at his tiny fingers and the soft dark hair that already covers his head. "He's perfect," Margaret says, her usual practicality softened by the miracle of new life. But Thomas simply nods, as if greeting an old friend. "Hello, James," he says. "I've been waiting for you." Elizabeth beckons Thomas closer. "Would you like to touch your brother's hand?" Thomas gently takes the baby's tiny hand in his. "Look, Father," he says. "The half-moon birthmark, just like in my drawing." William leans closer, and sure enough, between the infant's thumb and forefinger is a small birthmark in the shape of a half-moon, exactly as Thomas had drawn it just hours before. Elizabeth's eyes meet William's over their children's heads. No words are needed. The impossible has happened, and they both know it. The story of Thomas's drawing might have been forgotten, dismissed as a strange coincidence or a mother's intuition somehow transferred to her son, if not for what happened in the years that followed. As James grew, the resemblance to Thomas's drawing became increasingly apparent. The same cowlick in his hair, the same slightly crooked smile. But more disturbing were the things James knew, things he couldn't possibly know. At 3, he pointed to a photograph of Elizabeth's father, who had died before James was born. "Grandpa Howard taught me to fish," he said matter-of-factly, as the family sat in the parlor one Sunday afternoon. Elizabeth nearly dropped the teacup she was holding. "James, darling, what did you say?" "Grandpa Howard showed me how to put the worm on the hook without hurting it too much," James continued, playing with a wooden toy on the carpet. "He said it was still not nice for the worm, but sometimes we have to do not nice things to eat." William exchanged a startled glance with Elizabeth. Howard Jenkins had been an avid fisherman and had indeed taught Elizabeth to fish as a child, using almost those exact words about the worms. "Who told you about Grandpa Howard?" William asked carefully. James looked up, his expression puzzled as if the answer was obvious. "No one told me, I remember." At 4, during a thunderstorm, he crawled into his parents' bed and whispered, "Don't worry about the barn. It burned down before. but father rebuilt it stronger. William and Elizabeth exchanged glances in the darkness, lightning occasionally illuminating their concerned faces. The barn had indeed burned down after a lightning strike, 10 years earlier, before any of the children were born. William had rebuilt it with metal fixtures instead of the traditional wooden joints, something not visible from the outside. "James," Elizabeth asked softly, "how did you know about the barn burning down?" James yawned, already drifting back to sleep between his parents. "Thomas showed me. In the before time, these incidents continued, becoming so common that the family developed a tacit agreement not to react too strongly when James revealed knowledge he shouldn't possess." William kept a private journal documenting these occurrences, his scientific mind still searching for rational explanations even as the evidence of something inexplicable mounted. Thomas, meanwhile, continued to develop his artistic talent. By the age of 10, he was producing work that local artists praised as exceptional. His drawings became more detailed, more precise, and often more disturbing in their prescience. In early 1912, Thomas, now 13, became fixated on drawing ships. For weeks, he filled page after page with detailed renderings of a massive ocean liner. The final drawing showed the ship tilting at a sharp angle, partially submerged in dark waters. Tiny figures could be seen in the water around it. At the top of the drawing, Thomas had written Titanic and the date April 15, 1912. 3 weeks later, the RMS Titanic departed on its maiden voyage. When news of the disaster reached Deerfield, William locked the drawing away in his desk drawer, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn the key. That night, he found Thomas sitting alone in the garden, staring up at the stars. "You knew," William said, his voice tight with emotion. "You knew it would happen." Thomas looked up at his father, his expression somber. "I tried to draw it exactly as James showed me. I thought maybe someone would see it and stop it." "How could anyone have seen your drawing in time? How could anyone have believed it?" William asked, frustration edging his voice. "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "I just thought I had to try." William sat beside his son on the garden bench. "Thomas, these drawings, this knowledge you and James seem to share, it's not natural. It doesn't feel unnatural to us, Father," Thomas said simply. "It just feels like remembering." "Remembering what? Things that haven't happened yet? Or happened differently?" Thomas picked at a loose thread on his sleeve. "James says time isn't a straight line. It's more like a piece of cloth that can fold back on itself." William ran a hand over his face. His academic colleagues would think him mad if he spoke of such things. Yet here was evidence he could not deny. His own son had drawn the Titanic disaster weeks before it occurred. Can you see everything that will happen?" William asked hesitantly. Thomas shook his head. "No, just fragments, pieces that James shows me. And sometimes when I draw something, it changes what was going to happen." William felt a chill run through him. "Changes it? How?" "James says there are many possible futures. When I draw one, sometimes it makes that one more likely to happen." Thomas looked up at his father, his young face serious in the moonlight. "I try to be careful about what I draw now." In April 1913, Thomas fell ill with pneumonia. The doctor was called, but the prognosis was grim. Medicine in the early 20th century had its limitations, and pneumonia was often a death sentence, particularly for the young. The family gathered around Thomas's bed as his condition worsened. His breathing became labored, his skin hot with fever. Elizabeth applied cold compresses to his forehead and prayed, while William consulted with every medical expert he could reach. As Thomas lay in bed, his breathing labored, 6-year-old James never left his side. He sat in a small chair next to the bed, sometimes talking quietly to his brother when no one else was in the room. "You won't die," James told his brother confidently one evening when they were briefly alone. "You'll see the Great War, but you won't fight in it. You'll see man reach the moon. You'll live to be very old." Elizabeth, returning with fresh water, overheard this and hurried James from the room, worried that such talk would upset Thomas. "James, darling, you mustn't say such things," she said, kneeling before him in the hallway. "Thomas is very ill, and we must be careful not to upset him." James looked at her with those unsettlingly knowing eyes. "But he needs to know he'll get better, Mother. Otherwise he might give up." Elizabeth brushed James's hair back from his forehead, her heart aching at the strange burden her youngest son seemed to carry. "How can you be so sure he'll recover?" "Because I remember him as an old man," James said simply. "Much older than Father is now." Despite the doctor's pessimism, Thomas improved. His fever broke after a week of hovering near death, and within 2 weeks he was well enough to sit up and draw again. The doctor called it a miracle. William, watching his son recover, wondered what other name might apply to the inexplicable. When Thomas was strong enough, he showed his father what he had been working on, a series of drawings that seemed to depict a massive conflict, soldiers in trenches, wearing gas masks, surrounded by barbed wire and the chaos of modern warfare, artillery pieces larger than any currently in existence, strange armored vehicles moving across devastated landscapes. In the corner of the main drawing, Thomas had written, "Europe, 1916. "Where did you see this?" William demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. "James showed me," Thomas replied simply. "He says it will be called the Great War, and it will change everything." William carefully gathered the drawings. "These are not to be shown to anyone, do you understand? Not your sisters, not your friends at school. No one." Thomas nodded, his expression grave beyond his years. "I understand, Father." James said the same thing. The Great War came, just as Thomas had drawn it. In August 1914, Europe erupted into conflict. William kept Thomas's drawings hidden, along with others that seemed to predict events yet to come. When reports of trench warfare, poison gas, and tanks began to appear in newspapers in 1915 and 1916, William would sometimes take out the drawings and compare them to the photographs now appearing in the press. The similarity was undeniable. When the United States entered the war in 1917, both William and Elizabeth feared their oldest son would be drafted. Thomas was now 18, prime age for military service. But during his medical examination, the doctor discovered a heart murmur that had developed after his bout with pneumonia, exactly as James had predicted years earlier. Thomas was classified as 4F, unfit for military service. "You knew," William said to James, now 11, after they received the news. "You knew he wouldn't go to war." James nodded, not looking up from the book he was reading, a text on astronomy far beyond the usual reading level for a boy his age. "He has more important work to do here." William studied his youngest son, noting how different he was from other children his age. James was quiet, thoughtful, with an intelligence that sometimes seemed almost alien in its focus and depth. "James," William said carefully, "what exactly do you remember? About the future, I mean." James closed his book and considered the question. "It's like having two sets of memories. One is from this life, being your son, growing up here with Thomas and my sisters. The other is harder to explain. It's like memories from another version of me, one who wasn't born until much later." "Later? How much later?" 1930, James said precisely. "To different parents, in a different place. In that life, I never knew Thomas. I never knew any of you." A shadow passed over the boy's face. "I was alone in that life, until Thomas somehow saw me, drew me, pulled me here instead." William struggled to comprehend what his son was telling him. "Are you saying Thomas's drawing somehow changed your destiny?" James nodded slowly. "Time isn't as fixed as people think, Father, especially when it comes to consciousness. Thomas has a gift. He can see through the normal boundaries. And when he drew me as part of this family, it created a path for my consciousness to follow." William sat heavily in his chair, the implications overwhelming him. "This defies everything I understand about the natural world. The natural world is bigger than anyone understands yet," James said quietly. "There are rules, but they're not the ones science has discovered so far." The Blackwood family's strange story might have remained private if not for Dr. Harrison Fleming, a colleague of William's at the university who specialized in what was then the emerging field of psychology. In 1919, after the war's end, William found himself increasingly burdened by the knowledge he carried. His health began to suffer, and Elizabeth worried that keeping such secrets was taking a toll on him. "Perhaps you need to share this burden with someone who might understand," she suggested one evening, as they sat by the fire after the children had gone to bed. "Who could possibly understand this?" William asked wearily. "I'm a respected academic. If I were to speak of children who can see the future, I'd be laughed out of the university." "What about Dr. Fleming? He's always been interested in unusual psychological phenomena. And he's your friend, William. He wouldn't betray your confidence." After weeks of consideration, William finally confided in Fleming about the inexplicable predictions and drawings. They met in William's study, where William carefully laid out the evidence. Thomas's original drawing of James before his conception, the Titanic drawing, the war scenes that predated newspaper accounts, and dozens of other examples. Fleming was skeptical but intrigued. He began to document the case, interviewing family members and examining Thomas's drawings. He was particularly interested in the original family portrait from 1906, which Elizabeth had preserved carefully in a special folder. "There are rational explanations," Fleming assured William, though his voice lacked conviction as he studied the drawings spread across William's desk. "Perhaps Thomas overheard you and Elizabeth discussing the possibility of another child. Children are more perceptive than we give them credit for. And the Titanic, the war," William challenged. "The specific details about trench warfare and poison gas that weren't known to the public when Thomas drew them?" Fleming removed his glasses and polished them thoughtfully. "The human mind is capable of remarkable intuitive leaps, William. What appears to be precognition might simply be an unusually developed capacity for inference and pattern recognition." But Fleming couldn't explain the other drawings, the knowledge that seemed to pass between the brothers, or the fact that James, now 12, could describe in detail events that had happened before his birth. "Would you be willing to let me speak with the boys?" Fleming asked. "Separately, of course. I'll be discreet." William hesitated, then nodded. "On one condition. This remains between us. No publications, no presentations to the Psychological Society. These are my sons, Harrison, not case studies." Fleming agreed, and over the following months, he conducted a series of informal interviews with both Thomas and James. He was particularly interested in James, whose articulation of his dual memories challenged everything Fleming understood about consciousness and identity. "You speak of memories from a life you haven't lived," Fleming said during one session as he sat with James in the Blackwood garden. "How do you experience these memories? Are they like dreams?" James considered the question. "No, not like dreams. They're as clear as my memories of yesterday. But they're from a different track of time, a track that was changed when Thomas drew me into this family. And in this other track of time, you were born in 1930? James nodded. "To a family in Chicago. My father was a factory worker, my mother a seamstress. It was during what will be called the Great Depression." "Will be called?" Fleming raised an eyebrow. "It hasn't happened yet," James explained patiently. "But it will, starting in 1929. A massive economic collapse. Much worse than the panic of 1907. Fleming made a note, though his expression suggested he was humoring the boy rather than taking his predictions seriously. "And how do you believe Thomas was able to see you, as you put it, across time?" "Thomas sees connections that most people can't," James said. "Threads that run through time, linking related consciousness. We're connected, we always have been, across multiple timelines. He just happened to see that connection and draw it, making this timeline the dominant one for my consciousness." Fleming looked up from his notes. "That's a remarkably sophisticated concept for a 12-year-old. James smiled slightly. "I may be 12 in this body, Dr. Fleming, but part of me remembers being much older." In September 1922, tragedy struck the Blackwood family. William, now in his 60s, suffered a fatal heart attack while working in his study. The family was devastated, but James, at 16, seemed strangely prepared for the loss. The night before the funeral, Elizabeth found James in William's study, holding the original drawing from 1906. The room still held William's presence, his pipe in its stand, his academic papers neatly arranged, his spectacles folded on top of the open book he had been reading when the attack struck. "Father knew," James said quietly. "He knew I wasn't supposed to be here yet." Elizabeth sat beside her son, her grief momentarily overshadowed by confusion. Her hair, now streaked with gray, was arranged in a simpler style than the elaborate coiffures of her youth, but she still carried herself with the same quiet dignity. "What do you mean, James?" "I wasn't supposed to be born to you and Father," James explained, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I was supposed to come later, to another family, but Thomas saw me waiting and pulled me forward." Elizabeth felt a chill run through her body. Despite 16 years of witnessing the strange connection between her sons, their ability to know things they shouldn't, she still struggled to fully comprehend what it meant. "That's not possible." James looked at her with eyes that seemed far older than his years. "Mother, there are things about time that even the smartest people don't understand yet. Thomas can see through those cracks." Elizabeth took her son's hand, noting how it had grown from the tiny infant hand she had once held. "Your father spent years trying to understand what was happening with you and Thomas. He never reached any conclusions that satisfied him scientifically. Science doesn't have the language for this yet," James said, "but it will, eventually." What Thomas and I experience will someday be studied under branches of physics and psychology that don't exist yet. Elizabeth smoothed a hand over the drawing. Do you think, was your father's death something you knew would happen? Something Thomas knew? James hesitated. Thomas knew. He drew it last year but didn't show anyone. He's learned to be careful about which futures he makes more real by drawing them. And you? Did you know? I remembered father dying. Yes, James admitted. But in my other memories, he died much later, when I was an adult. By coming here, to this timeline, I got to know him as a father, which I never would have otherwise. His eyes filled with tears. I wouldn't trade that for anything, Mother, even knowing we'd lose him sooner. After William's death, Dr. Fleming continued his investigation into the Blackwood case, though he kept it private out of respect for the family and concern for his professional reputation. The field of psychology was still establishing itself as a legitimate science, and talk of precognition and temporal anomalies would not be well received by his colleagues. But Fleming meticulously documented everything: the drawings, the predictions, the strange connection between Thomas and James. He created a file that would eventually contain over 300 pages of notes, interviews, and analyses. In early 1923, he approached Elizabeth about conducting more formal research. I believe what your son's experience may be a previously undocumented form of shared consciousness, he explained, sitting in the same parlor where he had first discussed the case with William years earlier. With your permission, I'd like to design some controlled experiments. Elizabeth was hesitant. My husband was willing to explore this phenomenon in private, Dr. Fleming, but he was always concerned about the boys becoming objects of scientific curiosity. I understand your concerns, Fleming assured her. Any research would be conducted with the utmost discretion and respect, but consider the scientific importance. If we could document and verify true precognition, it would revolutionize our understanding of human consciousness. Elizabeth studied the aging psychologist, noting the genuine intellectual passion in his eyes. I'll discuss it with Thomas and James. They're old enough now to decide for themselves whether they wish to participate. To Fleming's disappointment, both brothers declined. Thomas, now 24, was focusing on his art career and had little interest in becoming a research subject. James, at 17, was preparing for university and expressed concern about the impact such research might have on his academic future. I'm sorry, Dr. Fleming, James explained during their final meeting. What my brother and I experience is real, but the world isn't ready to understand it yet. Premature exposure would only lead to misinterpretation and potential harm, both to us personally and to the scientific progress you hope to advance. Fleming couldn't hide his disappointment. When do you think the world will be ready? James considered the question. Not in your lifetime, I'm afraid. Perhaps not even in mine. At least not this version of mine. In 1927, Thomas, now 28 and an established artist, moved to New York City. His paintings were lauded for their visionary quality, often depicting scenes that seemed futuristic yet strangely familiar. Art critics noted his uncanny ability to capture the zeitgeist of an age not yet arrived. His first major exhibition featured landscapes of cities with soaring glass towers, streets filled with sleek automobiles unlike any currently manufactured, and people communicating through small handheld devices. The art world interpreted these as brilliant extrapolations of current technological trends. No one suspected they were glimpses of a future Thomas had seen through his connection with James. James remained in Deerfield with Elizabeth and studied physics at the university where his father had taught. His professors noted his particular interest in theoretical concepts related to time and quantum mechanics, fields that were just beginning to emerge in scientific discourse. Your son has a remarkable intuition for abstract physical concepts, one professor told Elizabeth during a university reception. Some of his questions suggest connections that even established physicists haven't considered. Elizabeth smiled politely. James has always had a unique perspective on the world. As James progressed through his studies, he began to find scientific language that approximated his experiences. When Einstein's theories of relativity became more widely discussed in academic circles, James found parallels to what he had tried to explain to Dr. Fleming years earlier. Time as a dimension rather than simply a linear progression, he explained to Thomas during one of his visits home from New York. Einstein is getting closer to the reality we've experienced, though his mathematics doesn't yet account for consciousness as a factor in temporal flexibility. Thomas, dressed in the fashionable attire of a successful New York artist, smiled at his younger brother. Does it help? Having scientific concepts that come closer to explaining us? James considered the question. It's like finally hearing people start to speak a language I've known all my life. They're still learning the basic vocabulary, but at least the conversation has begun. Dr. Harrison Fleming died in 1931 at the age of 76. His files on the Blackwood case were stored away with his academic papers in the university archives. They might have remained there, gathering dust and forgotten, if not for Dr. Eleanor Simmons. In 1952, Dr. Simmons, a professor of psychology at the same university, was researching the early history of clinical psychology in New England when she discovered Fleming's Blackwood file. Initially, she dismissed it as pseudoscientific nonsense, the product of an era when the boundaries between psychology and spiritualism were still blurry. But something about the meticulous documentation and Fleming's clearly reluctant fascination with the case intrigued her. The file contained detailed notes, drawings that had predicted historical events with startling accuracy, and transcripts of interviews that seemed too consistent and specific to be mere fabrications. When she learned that James Blackwood was still alive and teaching physics at the university, she decided to approach him. By then, James was in his mid-40s, a respected professor with a reputation for brilliant, but sometimes unconventional theoretical work. Their first meeting was tense. James's office was lined with bookshelves filled with texts on quantum physics, philosophy of time, and consciousness studies. On his desk sat a framed photograph of his family from 1910, William, Elizabeth, and all 4 children, with Thomas standing protectively beside his younger brother. Dr. Fleming promised my father this would remain confidential, he said stiffly, after Simmons explained her discovery of the file. I understand your concern, Dr. Simmons replied. She was in her early 30s with a keen intelligence that reminded James somewhat of his sister Catherine. But from a scientific perspective, what your family experienced, what you and your brother Thomas experienced, could be incredibly valuable to our understanding of human consciousness. James studied her for a long moment. Have you heard of quantum entanglement, Dr. Simmons? She shook her head, her short, practical hairstyle reflecting the professional style of the early 1950s. It's a physical phenomenon where pairs of particles become connected in such a way that the quantum state of each particle cannot be described independently of the others, James explained. What happens to one immediately affects the other, regardless of distance. I'm afraid I don't see the relevance, Simmons admitted. Thomas and I were entangled before I was born, James said simply. I don't expect you to understand or believe that. I'm not sure I fully understand it myself, despite decades of study. But over the following months, James gradually opened up to Dr. Simmons. Something about her approach, her genuine intellectual curiosity, unclouded by sensation-seeking or academic politics, reminded him of his father. He showed her Thomas's drawings, dozens of them, preserved carefully in a portfolio, drawings of television sets from the 1920s, nuclear explosions from the 1930s, computers from the 1940s, each dated years before the technology existed or events occurred. Thomas never claimed to predict the future, James explained as they sat in his study one evening, the portfolio open between them. He said he simply drew what I showed him, and I never felt like I was predicting anything. I was remembering. Remembering what? Simmons asked, carefully handling a drawing of a mushroom cloud dated 1938, 7 years before the first atomic bomb test. Another timeline, James said quietly. One where I wasn't born until 1930, to different parents. One where Thomas and I never knew each other. Simmons looked up, her scientific skepticism warring with the undeniable evidence before her. You're suggesting some form of temporal displacement? That your consciousness somehow migrated from one potential timeline to another? Not migrated, James corrected. More like reoriented. The consciousness that is me exists across multiple temporal dimensions. Normally, it would have manifested primarily in the 1930-born version, but Thomas's ability to perceive these connections, combined with his act of drawing me into his family, created a stronger manifestation point in this timeline. Simmons set down the drawing she was holding. This contradicts everything we understand about the linear nature of time and the continuity of personal identity. Yes, James agreed simply. It does. Dr. Simmons spent the next 5 years studying the Blackwood case. She interviewed Thomas, now living in California and renowned in artistic circles. His studio overlooked the Pacific Ocean, and his work had evolved from the futuristic scenes of his youth to more abstract explorations of time and perception. "I don't draw the future much anymore," he told Simmons during her visit. "I've learned that making certain futures more visible can sometimes make them more likely to manifest. It's a responsibility I'm not always comfortable with." She spoke with Catherine and Margaret, who confirmed the strange incidents from their childhood. Margaret, practical as ever, had become a physician and viewed her brother's connection through a medical lens. "I've often wondered if they share some rare form of neurological connection," she speculated. "Perhaps something that allows Thomas to access James's memories and vice versa. The temporal aspects are harder to explain, of course." Catherine, who had become a writer, was more accepting of the inexplicable nature of her brother's experiences. "There are more things in heaven and earth, as Shakespeare would say. I stopped trying to rationalize it years ago and simply accepted that my brothers experienced the world differently than most people." Simmons even tracked down neighbors and friends of the family who remembered Thomas's uncanny drawings and predictions. "That boy knew things he shouldn't have known," the Blackwood's former housekeeper, now elderly, told her. "I remember when he drew that ocean liner sinking, weeks before the Titanic went down. Professor Blackwood was white as a sheet when the news came. In 1957, Dr. Simmons prepared a paper for the American Journal of Psychology titled Temporal Displacement in Consciousness, the Blackwood Case Study. She had carefully balanced scientific rigor with the extraordinary nature of the evidence, framing the case as a challenge to conventional understanding of consciousness rather than a claim of supernatural abilities. But before she could submit it, something extraordinary happened. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. The space age had begun, catching the American scientific establishment by surprise and triggering what would soon be called the space race. Simmons immediately called Thomas. "Did you draw this? Did you see this coming?" There was a long pause on the line. "Check the portfolio," Thomas finally said. 1917, I think." Simmons returned to the university and pulled out James's portfolio of Thomas's early drawings. There it was, a detailed sketch of a spherical object orbiting the Earth, dated August 4, 1917. Thomas had been 18 years old. In the corner of the drawing, in Thomas's neat handwriting, "Jay says this will change everything." Simmons sat back in her chair, the implications washing over her. In 1917, the idea of artificial satellites was purely theoretical, confined to the most speculative scientific literature. Yet Thomas had drawn a remarkably accurate representation, 4 decades before it became reality. She added this finding to her paper, strengthening her argument that the Blackwood case represented a genuine anomaly that deserved serious scientific consideration. The Blackwood case took on new significance in the context of the Cold War and the space race. Dr. Simmons's research caught the attention of government officials interested in potential applications for national security. In 1958, representatives from a classified program approached her at the university. "We're interested in what you call temporal displacement," one official told her during a meeting in her office. He was a nondescript man in a gray suit with the carefully neutral demeanor of someone accustomed to sensitive work, particularly as it relates to the Blackwood brothers. Simmons was hesitant, protective of both her research and the Blackwood family. "This is scientific research, not military intelligence. Dr. Simmons, if there's even a remote possibility that human consciousness can perceive future events, the implications for national security are profound." The official leaned forward slightly, particularly in the current global climate. Simmons understood the subtext. The Cold War had created an atmosphere of constant anxiety about Soviet technological advances. The launch of Sputnik had demonstrated that America's presumed scientific superiority wasn't as secure as many had believed. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked cautiously. "We'd like full access to your research, and we'd like to speak with both Blackwood brothers, particularly James, given his scientific background." Simmons reluctantly agreed to share her research, but insisted on conditions. The Blackwood brothers would not be harassed or subjected to experimentation, and her findings would eventually be published in academic journals. The officials agreed, though Simmons suspected they had no intention of honoring the second condition. National security would provide a convenient justification for classifying anything related to potential precognition. James Blackwood was not surprised when government agents came to speak with him. He had been expecting them since Sputnik. "My brother's ability is not a weapon," he told them firmly during their first meeting in his university office, "and I'm not a fortune teller." The lead agent, a man named Richards, maintained a respectful tone. "Dr. Blackwood, we're not approaching this as a weapon. We see it as a potential strategic resource. Your brother's drawings predicted Sputnik 4 decades ago. What else might they have predicted that could help us prepare for future challenges?" "Thomas rarely draws the future anymore," James explained. "And when he does, he keeps those drawings private. He's concerned about the responsibility of potentially influencing which futures manifest." "But you still have his earlier drawings," Richards pressed. "Drawings that may depict events yet to come." James nodded slowly. "Some, yes, but they're fragments, not comprehensive visions, and many show potential futures that never materialized, or haven't yet. We'd still like to see them." But the pressure continued. Throughout the early 1960s, as the space race intensified and the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, both James and Thomas were repeatedly approached by various government agencies. Thomas, now in his 60s, withdrew from public life, refusing to sell or exhibit his newer works. He moved to a remote property on the California coast, where he continued to paint but shared his work only with his immediate family. James continued his academic career but focused his research on increasingly esoteric areas of theoretical physics, areas that seemed to have little practical application for military or intelligence purposes. In 1962, Dr. Simmons finally published a heavily edited version of her paper on the Blackwood case. The most controversial aspects, the apparent precognition, the concept of timeline displacement, were removed at the insistence of her university, which feared association with fringe science. The published paper described the case as an interesting example of shared familial delusion and suggestibility in children. Simmons was devastated by the compromise but felt it was better to have some record of the case in academic literature than none at all. "I'm sorry," she told James after the publication. "They gutted it." James smiled gently. "Don't be sorry. You did what was possible within the constraints of the time. Future researchers will rediscover Fleming's original files and your complete notes. They'll come to their own conclusions when the intellectual climate is more receptive." "How can you be so certain?" Simmons asked. James's smile held a hint of mystery. "Let's just say I have a good feeling about it." July 20th, 1969. The world watched as Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, fulfilling humanity's ancient dream of reaching the moon. In a nursing home in Deerfield, Massachusetts, Elizabeth Blackwood, now 90 years old, watched the broadcast with her son James. Thomas had flown in from California to be with them for the historic moment. Elizabeth's once chestnut hair was now white, her face lined with the passage of decades, but her eyes remained bright and alert as she watched the grainy television images of Armstrong's historic step. "You told me this would happen," Elizabeth said to her sons, her voice thin with age. "Both of you, in your own ways." Thomas nodded, his artist's hands now gnarled with arthritis. "I drew it in 1921, the American flag on the lunar surface." James said nothing, but his eyes never left the television screen. At 73, he had retired from teaching but continued his theoretical work. His hair was silver, his face carrying the distinguished lines of age, but his gaze was still sharp with the same intelligence that had puzzled and fascinated Dr. Fleming decades earlier. Later that night, after Elizabeth had gone to sleep, the brothers sat together in the visitors' lounge of the nursing home. The facility was quiet, most residents and staff already retired for the evening. "You were right," Thomas said quietly. "About everything." James smiled sadly. "Not everything. Some things changed because of us, because of what we knew." "Do you regret it?" Thomas asked. "Being born to our family instead of the other one?" James considered the question. "How can I regret the only life I've known? Besides, the other timeline." He stopped abruptly. "What about it?" James shook his head. "Some things are better not drawn." Thomas studied his brother. "There was something worse in that other timeline, wasn't there? Something you never showed me." "Much worse," James admitted after a long silence. "A war that made the world wars look like skirmishes. Technology turned against humanity in ways I'm grateful didn't manifest in this timeline. Because I drew you into our family? Perhaps. Or perhaps because you drew other futures that helped humanity choose better paths." James reached out and placed his hand over his brother's. "Your gift wasn't just seeing through time, Thomas. It was helping to guide it, even if you never fully realized that's what you were doing." In 1973, Dr. Eleanor Simmons died suddenly of a cerebral hemorrhage. Her complete files on the Blackwood case disappeared from her office before her colleagues could examine them. The university's official position was that no such research had ever been sanctioned. James attended her funeral, standing quietly at the back of the church. He had known she would die young. It was one of the fragments of knowledge that had come to him decades earlier, but knowing didn't make the loss any easier to bear. She had been one of the few people who had truly tried to understand the phenomenon he and Thomas had experienced throughout their lives. After the service, a young man approached him. "Dr. Blackwood, I'm David Simmons, Eleanor's nephew." James shook his hand. "I'm very sorry for your loss. Your aunt was a remarkable woman and a true scientist." "Thank you. She spoke of you often." David hesitated. "She left something for you in her will, a key to a safe deposit box. She said you would know what it contained." James did know. The complete, unedited version of Simmons's research on the Blackwood case, preserved for future researchers who might be ready to consider its implications. "Thank you, David. Your aunt was always thinking ahead." Thomas Blackwood died peacefully in his sleep in 1986 at the age of 87. His final exhibition, held the year before his death, featured landscapes and portraits, conventional subjects rendered with his distinctive style. There were no visions of the future, no unsettling predictions. The art world mourned the loss of a visionary painter. Retrospectives of his work focused on his contributions to American modernism, his unique perspective on urbanization and technology, and his later, more contemplative landscapes. But after his death, James discovered a locked portfolio in Thomas's studio. Inside were dozens of drawings dated from the 1970s through the 1980s, scenes depicting events yet to come: the fall of the Berlin Wall, the rise of the Internet, strange weather patterns in coastal cities partially submerged in rising seas, and one final drawing, dated just a week before Thomas's death, a simple portrait of James as an old man sitting beside a much younger woman who bore a striking resemblance to Dr. Simmons. On the back, Thomas had written, "She'll find you in 2006. She'll have questions. She'll help you understand what we couldn't." James sat in Thomas's studio, surrounded by his brother's last works, and wept, not just for the loss of his brother, but for the gift Thomas had given him, the gift of this life, this timeline, this family, and for the burden of knowledge they had shared across the decades. James Blackwood lived a quiet life after his brother's death. He retired from teaching and devoted himself to organizing Thomas's artistic legacy. Most of the predictive drawings remained private, locked away in a vault. The art world celebrated Thomas as a visionary modernist, unaware of the literal truth behind that description. James occasionally corresponded with researchers in quantum physics and consciousness studies, offering subtle guidance that influenced the development of these fields without revealing the source of his insights. He watched as science slowly developed concepts and terminology that came closer to explaining what he and Thomas had experienced. In 1994, he published a paper titled "Consciousness as a Non-Local Quantum Phenomenon," which proposed theoretical mechanisms for how awareness might transcend conventional temporal boundaries. The paper was largely dismissed as speculative, but a small group of forward-thinking physicists recognized its innovative approach to long-standing questions about the nature of time and awareness. In 2003, James suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. He moved into an assisted living facility in Deerfield, not far from the house where he had grown up. His mind remained sharp, even as his body failed him. He spent hours watching the news, observing as world events unfolded according to patterns he had glimpsed throughout his life. And then, in early 2006, exactly 100 years after Thomas had first drawn the mysterious family portrait, a young woman came to visit James. "Professor Blackwood, my name is Sarah Simmons. I believe you knew my grandmother, Dr. Eleanor Simmons." James studied her face from his wheelchair, recognition dawning. The resemblance to her grandmother was striking, though Sarah's style reflected the early 2000s rather than the 1950s. "Thomas drew you," he said softly. "He knew you would come." Sarah nodded. "I found some of my grandmother's notes in our attic. Not everything was taken. I've been researching your case for my doctoral dissertation in quantum physics." Quantum physics, not psychology?" James asked, surprised. "The boundaries between disciplines are more fluid now," Sarah explained. "What my grandmother saw as psychological phenomena, we might now interpret through the lens of quantum mechanics. Entanglement, superposition, multiple worlds theory." James gestured weakly to a cabinet near his bed. "Third drawer. There's a key taped under the second drawer." The portfolio has everything Thomas saw, everything I remembered. Sarah retrieved the key and opened the drawer, finding a slim leather portfolio. Inside were dozens of drawings, each dated and annotated in Thomas's hand, depicting events spanning from the 1920s to the early 2000s, technology that hadn't existed when the drawings were made, historical events that Thomas couldn't have known about, personal moments from James's life that had yet to occur when they were drawn. Sarah looked up, her scientific skepticism warring with the evidence before her. "This is extraordinary. It's also a burden," James said quietly. "Knowledge without the power to fully use it or explain it." Over the following months, Sarah visited James regularly, poring over Thomas's drawings and James's notes. She brought scientific journals and books that James, now confined to his facility, couldn't access. "Your theories were ahead of their time," she told him during one visit. "What you were describing in the 1950s, quantum entanglement across temporal dimensions, we're only now developing the mathematical framework to express these concepts." "Thomas understood it intuitively," James replied. "He didn't need equations. He could see it." "And you? How did you experience it?" James looked out the window, watching a group of children playing in the spring sunshine. "Imagine having two complete sets of memories, one from the life you're living, another from a life you never actually lived, but somehow remember just as clearly. Imagine knowing things you couldn't possibly know, remembering events that haven't happened yet." "That sounds overwhelming." "It was, sometimes," James admitted, "but it also gave me a perspective few people ever have. The knowledge that time isn't as fixed as we think, that choices matter in ways we can't always see, that consciousness is more mysterious and powerful than science has yet recognized." In June 2006, Sarah brought a team of colleagues to meet James, quantum physicists, neuroscientists, and one art historian who specialized in Thomas's work. Under strict confidentiality agreements, James shared the full story and evidence with them. The original family drawing from 1906 was subjected to modern analysis: carbon dating, spectroscopic examination of the pigments, handwriting analysis. Everything confirmed its authenticity. The drawing had indeed been created in 1906, months before Elizabeth Blackwood became pregnant with James. "The implications are extraordinary," one physicist said, after examining Thomas's drawings of technological developments that came decades after the drawings were created. "Not just for physics, but for our understanding of consciousness itself." James smiled tiredly. "I've been waiting a long time to hear someone say that." On August 17, 2006, his 100th birthday, and exactly 1 century after his birth, James Blackwood died peacefully in his sleep. In accordance with his wishes, Sarah and her team were granted full access to all of Thomas's drawings and James's research. The team established the Blackwood Institute for Temporal Studies, dedicated to examining the intersection of quantum physics, consciousness, and time perception. Their work remains largely theoretical, conducted quietly away from sensationalist attention. But in academic circles, the Blackwood phenomenon has become a subject of serious study. The possibility that human consciousness is not as linear or as temporally bound as we once believed. The most compelling piece of evidence remains that first family portrait, drawn by a 7-year-old boy in 1906, including a brother who wasn't yet conceived. A drawing that, according to multiple witnesses and documentation, existed months before Elizabeth Blackwood knew she was pregnant. Modern analysis has revealed something else about that drawing, something Dr. Fleming, Dr. Simmons, and even James himself never noticed. In the background, barely visible behind the family group, Thomas had sketched a faint figure of a young woman with a notebook. Art historians initially dismissed it as a pentimento, an alteration or underlying image in a painting that shows through when the top layer of paint becomes transparent with age. But Sarah Simmons recognized herself immediately. In 2023, the Blackwood Institute published its first major paper, proposing what they call consciousness entanglement theory, the idea that human awareness can, under certain conditions, transcend conventional temporal boundaries. The paper draws on advances in quantum physics, particularly the concept of quantum non-locality, to suggest that consciousness might not be as temporally bound as traditional models assume. It proposes that certain individuals might have an enhanced ability to access information across what we perceive as time, not through supernatural means, but through natural processes not yet fully understood by science. Critics dismiss it as pseudoscience dressed in quantum terminology. Supporters point to the meticulously documented Blackwood case as evidence that our understanding of time, consciousness, and reality is still fundamentally incomplete. The debate continues in scientific circles, but the original drawing that started it all is now secured in a climate-controlled vault, its significance still not fully understood. And in universities around the world, a new generation of physicists and psychologists are asking questions that Thomas and James Blackwood grappled with their entire lives. Is time truly linear? Can consciousness move freely through what we perceive as past, present, and future? Are some individuals born with an innate ability to see beyond the constraints of their moment in history? The answers remain elusive. But as James Blackwood often said in his later years, the most important scientific revelations begin not with certainty, but with the humble acknowledgement of what we do not yet understand. As for Sarah Simmons, she continues her research at the Blackwood Institute, driven by questions that span generations. Sometimes, late at night in her office, she finds herself staring at a reproduction of Thomas's original family drawing, specifically at the faint figure in the background that looks so much like herself, and she wonders if somewhere in time, a child is drawing her right now. The photograph sits on the mahogany table, edges worn and yellowed with time. A family portrait from 1906. Father, mother, 3 children, and something else. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there yet. Someone who crossed the boundaries of time through the innocent vision of a child with a piece of charcoal and a blank sheet of paper. This has been Shadow Frames. Like and subscribe for more stories from the boundaries of the unexplained.